thank God, because without this program, I absolutely would have not made it to see my 40th birthday, which I just had. I came into program 8 years ago in 2012, and I guess to start I'll just express what I was like back then, suffering a lot, and in the dark, where like I always had awareness of what was going on in my life, but I didn't have any hindsight. I didn't have my voice, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So back 9 years ago, I'd been working with a life coach, and then finally, and he would like talk to me about my life and like what's going on and how does this apply to setting goals for my career. And there was one morning that we met, or maybe it was an afternoon, and I just like started crying, and I actually had a paper bag that I put over my head because I was so ashamed, and I was just crying. And this is like in Panera. So I'm like in Panera with a paper bag over my head with my life coach, like being like, okay. And he said, 7:15 tomorrow morning, meet me at the farmer's market. You're going to a SLAA meeting with me. And I was like, what's SLAA? And he was like, sex and love addicts. And I was like, oh, it's come to this. And what had happened was that my ex-boyfriend had come to town from the East Coast, and he invited me over to his hotel. And he was a great guy. Like, had I stayed on the East Coast, like, he was, marriage material. Pretty great guy. And so we hooked up that evening in 2012, and I didn't really want to, but it was just like, it's what he wanted. And so I always would do what the man wanted, really, and I didn't have that voice to say no. I couldn't uphold healthy boundaries. And after we had hooked up, then he said something about his newborn. And I was like, what? And he was like, yeah, my wife just had a baby. And I was like, your what? Had a what? So he hadn't told me that he got married and had a kid. And so I just felt like horrible. And why does this keep happening to me? Because that wasn't the first time that I had been with a married man. Hello, college professor. Gross. I have a lot of gross stories in my history. And that actually, like, saying that they're gross and disgusting helps me regain my dignity, which I have regained my dignity. And it took a long time to do that. A lot because I didn't have the language at the time to express what was happening to me, or so what I mean by that is, like, for example, the worst times in my life were in my 20s when I went to college in New York City. And I remember at times these things, some, bad things were happening to me. Like, I was just trusting dangerous men. And all of the characteristics of sex and love addicts, when I first came into program and heard those characteristics, I was like, thank God there's finally the language to express what I've been suffering from. Because back in New York, or in my 20s, I didn't have the language. And so I would, like, for example, the culture at my college was just have sex, be liberated, this is what feminism is. And they, hand out free condoms everywhere, and there was always alcohol, free booze at parties and stuff. And all I could do at the time was, like, express my anger that people are using each other. And at the time, there was no language like sexual assault or campus rape. Like, those words didn't exist. And before I went to college, I had been working in film. And so I started working in film when I was 19. And thank God for the Me Too movement that, I guess kicked off in 2018, because then that gave me the validation that I wasn't the only one that had gotten exploited and abused by working in film, by producers and famous actors too. And during those times in my 20s, like, I would seek help. I sought help from the school nurse. I sought help from counselors, social worker, and I never was told that, Leigha, you've been sexually abused, or Leigha, you've been raped. It was always like, well, why were you there? Or, what about them? I actually had a social worker say to me when I was telling her about this producer that, who had sexually assaulted me. I was working for him still, and I was like coming to her terrified that he was somehow going to get me in his hotel room again, because I couldn't stop the meeting. He always would somehow get me in his hotel room, and I didn't want to go, but I would end up going. And so I remember telling her this, and I was like, I'm so scared. And she was like, but you need the job. And I was like, yeah. And she was like, so this is just how men are. Just don't go in his hotel room. And I'm like, but how? Like, how do I not? And I've since talked to a friend who is a social work professor, and she's like, Leigha, that woman should get disbarred. Like, we should follow her now and file a report. And just my friend saying that, like, gave me so much of my life back and my dignity. And so I also credit the Me Too movement a lot for having helped me heal, because even though I had program, like, it wasn't until I could hear from pop culture that, like, this is wrong, what's happening to women, and it needs to stop. It wasn't until I could hear my story in the mainstream that I could truly start to, like, feel safer in the world. And so SLAA, I went through, like, 3 sponsors in the first several years. And then the third sponsor I had, I've had four sponsors. I'm still in touch with the fourth one. The third one was really, really helpful. I did a lot of spiritual growth with her and going through the steps. And so getting into the steps, I love surrendering my will. What this program taught me, this program has taught me so much. And I remember, like, over the course of the years, there would just be these, like, times where it's like I heard the serenity prayer for the first time, even though I had been in program, like, several years, like, and then, like, oh, this is what that means at a deeper level. And I remember a woman saying that this program is really all about God. And when she said that, I was like, oh, and another light bulb went off. And that's when I really started to understand what the disease is, whether it's alcohol or, addiction, sex and love addiction, that it's a spiritual malady. And so that I had become really estranged for myself. I mean, estranged from my family. And so actually I'll get more into my story now, and then I'll swing back into, so my history. I am a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, from a school teacher when I was 9 years old. And that event, I didn't recall what it actually meant until I had been in program a year. And so when I was in program a year and I was thinking back, just like, maybe I was working on a step, and I remember I was just gazing out the window and I thought, oh my God, when my 4th grade teacher would force me to sit on his lap, that was sexual for him. Like, oh my God, he was masturbating. And so I never knew that as a child. I knew something was wrong and I would get blackouts, but I didn't know that it was sexual until I was an adult. And so now I understand more about, like, repressed memories and these things. And then at the time, so understanding this childhood trauma, this pattern repeated in my life. And in the childhood trauma, my mother had tried to fight. She didn't know what was wrong with me. All I would do is come home and cry and hide in the closet. And so she ended up fighting the school board, trying to get this teacher investigated and trying to get me removed from the class. And recently, like, from 2017 to 2019 was a very gnarly period for me. So I had gotten, like, sort of massively re-triggered in 2017 because I like had this project that I started back when I was in college, that I had to finish with a Kickstarter. And so it brought all this stuff back up. And at that time, my mother was like, oh my gosh, look what I found. I found the transcripts from when you were in 4th grade. And she sent them to me. And I had a female principal, and I see this female principal was like, my mom had taken very copious notes. And the principal, who was a female, had said to my mother, like, what's wrong with Leigha? Does she not like men? Like, does she not like attention from men? Like, asking a child that. So all of this goes to say that, like, we live in a very toxic culture. We live in a really toxic world towards women and women's sexuality. And so while I've had excruciatingly painful suffering, like facing all of this in my life, I know that my fight and my struggle and yelling for justice has also kept me alive and helped tip the scales for the Me Too movement to happen. Even when before that happened, I was trying to, report somebody in Hollywood, and I got shamed by other women for it. And I'm just so glad that we're in a different world now. It's so important for us to find our voices and speak out and to heal our sexuality and regain our dignity. And so what the program has taught me is like deeper meanings to all these things. So like finding my dignity really came from healing myself and, working the steps within myself. I remember there would be times when I would hear people having forgiven their toxic parents. Like my father was my great qualifier, and then my mother, but first my father. And I remember thinking, like, there's no way I can ever forgive my father for having not helped my mother, back when she had to fight the school when I was a kid. And, being like cheating on my mom and all this stuff. And actually, forgiveness is a process, and I owe the fact that I can say I've healed my relationship with my father because of boundaries and because of learning boundaries through this program and how to enforce boundaries. So there have been several years when I've had no contact with my father, and I've watched my recovery improve and my health improve. And so now I'm able to have a healthy relationship with him at a distance on my terms. That I'm now my parent, I am my adult, and I can see, him with compassion because he doesn't have what I have with my connection to higher power and my connection to my community. So I actually pity him a little bit, and I pray for him. I pray that he can know love truly. And that was another thing that I learned in this program. I remember praying, I love the 3rd step prayer. I offer my will to thee to do with me and build with me as thou wilt, and relieve me of the bondage of self so that I may better do thy will. I say that prayer several times a day still. And what does it mean by will? I offer my will to thee. My will is my desire. My will is my desire to receive for myself alone for how I think it should be. And so I'm surrendering my attachment to my idea, and I'm surrendering my attachment to my desire. And then through my spirituality, I've learned that we always have desire. I've tried to transcend my desires, let me be free of desire, let me be all Buddhist. And then I've learned through Kabbalah that there's no way we can get rid of desire because that's what we're made of. And so the spiritual process is to transmute our desires so that it's not just for ourselves alone, but that it's a healed, ego so that I may serve. And so it's this, body-mind entity that I offer to higher power. And it's there's really not much we have to do, but surrender, because everything in my experience, in my life, everything is destined. It's really like everything is higher power and everything is love. I know higher power is all loving, and it's just like this human, experience where we don't know that, or we have to go through this journey where we transform and have to go through, especially I guess if you have, trauma, which I think all of us do, that this trauma repeats in our life over and over until finally we are strong enough that we conquer it, so that we become the metaphorical kings and queens. And that's how I've put that crown of dignity back on, by going through this process consciously, which brings me to my favorite step 11, the conscious contact with higher power. And I really love being able to achieve conscious contact with the group. And I've come to feel that it's really through others and being of service to others and praying for others and wishing them well that I found true recovery. Because before I knew how to pray for others and connect with others, to connect to the consciousness of higher power, to connect conscious contact with higher power, I still was just coming to meetings as like my broken self, as like my broken ego that just felt dirty and ashamed and like just still in my addiction. I identify as a sex, love, and fantasy addict. I'm like looking out the window, making sure my neighbor doesn't hear me. The fantasy part is explained in the characteristics of like, I was obsessed with just fantasizing, and as well as like, so, or I don't remember what the other characteristic says about fantasizing, but that's me as well. And coming into reality has been really beautiful, because like reality is really simple, like, and that's where surrendering can bring me great peace, because I know like if I am attached to my idea of how something should be, I get in pain. It hurts that way. But if I can work the steps internally, do inventory on my desires, call a friend, reach out, then I can actually be open to miracles. And I feel that boundaries also create miracles. So for example, one of my greatest fears that's also related to having acted out or been taken advantage of, fear of housing insecurity. So I was like, I'm terrified of paying rent on the first of the month. I'm terrified of landlords. I hate the word landlord. It's like, it makes me feel so insecure. And then with this whole, with the pandemic happening and getting laid off, it's like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And I had to face my greatest fear and call my landlord, who lives out of state. And I explained to him, like, I don't know if you're aware of what's going on in California, but we're not allowed to work. And I was so scared. And he said, just, okay, you don't have to pay rent now. Just like, we'll add it on later. And that's a huge miracle for me. And I know that a lot of people are in this scary situation. And so I'm praying for them too, that they can feel peace. And just me being able to call him was a huge deal for me. In the past, when I'd be scared, I would offer myself sexually or flirt or and then I would wonder why I would get taken advantage of. And now I understand that nobody is entitled to my sexuality, or I will not even, I know how to not flirt with men now. I understand that I can even say, I'm smiling because I'm happy. It has nothing to do with you. Please don't sexualize me. Step back. I'm very okay to be direct about these things. And I never had the voice for this in the past. So to close up, I guess I'll share real quick this drawing I'd made in the past. This is like my recipe for program: self-forgiveness, fellowship, company of the wise, doing inventory and inquiry, and then taking contrary action and self-control. So I have a triangle here, and on each point of the triangle it says actions, thoughts, and feelings. And it's really important to make sure that those things are in harmony, because for me they never were. They were always I would do actions that I didn't want to do, and my thoughts would be, I don't want this to happen. My feelings would be terror, but my action would be, making out with somebody. And then over here, I have the third step prayer to surrender to higher power, the attachments I feel to my desires, because I believe higher power has a plan for me that I want to learn. And that way I can come into my full presence and be of service to humanity. And I'm just so grateful that I'm not a force of destruction anymore, but that I'm a force of love and peace, I sure hope. So thank you for letting me share.